Have you ever wondered how a single event can change the course of history? Just consider the summer of 1914 in the city of Sarajevo, nestled in the heart of Bosnia. An event took place here that would forever alter the world's trajectory. On a fateful day in June, a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped into the path of a car carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie. The shots Princip fired that day echoed far beyond the city's borders, reaching the ears of leaders and generals across Europe. Franz Ferdinand wasn't just any archduke. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a significant power player in the precarious European political landscape of the time. His death was the spark that ignited a powder keg of nationalistic tensions, territorial disputes, and intricate alliances. In the Balkans, where Sarajevo is located, these issues were particularly heightened. This region, often referred to as the powder keg of Europe, was a complex web of ethnicities, religions, and political aspirations. The assassination was seen as a direct affront to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a challenge that couldn't be ignored. At the same time, a complex system of alliances was in place among the major powers of Europe. This was designed to maintain a balance of power, but it also meant that a conflict involving one or two nations could quickly draw in others. Austria-Hungary's ally Germany was soon involved, and from there the dominoes began to fall. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand set a series of events in motion. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, declared war on Serbia. Russia, bound by treaty to Serbia, announced mobilization of its vast army in her defense. Germany then declared war on Russia. Within a week, France, Belgium, Great Britain, and other countries had been pulled into the conflict. And so, the fuse was lit for what would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. The world stood on the brink of war, a war that would last 4 long years and claim millions of lives. This was the beginning of World War I, a war that would reshape nations and redefine warfare. The gunshot in Sarajevo echoed across Europe. This single act of violence set the stage for a conflict that would quickly spread, involving nations far beyond the borders of Austria-Hungary and Serbia. You see, the world of the early 20th century was a tangled web of alliances and treaties. Nations pledged to defend each other, forming protective blocks that spanned continents. But these alliances, designed to maintain a delicate balance of power, would instead serve to rapidly escalate the conflict. In the blink of an eye, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria by a Serbian nationalist not only triggered a war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, but also dragged their respective allies into the fray. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Great War, or World War I. On one side, there were the Central Powers, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. On the other side, there were the Allied Powers, initially made up of France, Britain, and Russia. Later, Italy and Japan would join the Allies, as well as the United States, although that wouldn't happen until a few years into the conflict. This wasn't a war that was confined to a single region or continent. It was a truly global conflict, one that spread across Europe like wildfire. From the Western Front, where French and British forces faced off against Germany, to the Eastern Front, where Russia clashed with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the war was a brutal and bloody affair. It was a time of great upheaval and uncertainty. Borders were redrawn, empires crumbled, and new nations emerged from the ashes. The war affected everyone, from the soldiers on the front lines to the civilians back home. It was a war that would forever change the face of Europe and the world. By 1914, the whole of Europe was embroiled in war. Imagine being confined in a narrow, muddy trench for weeks on end. This was the grim reality for millions of soldiers during World War I. It was a new kind of warfare, one that was defined by its brutality and its stagnant, muddy trenches. Trench warfare was not just a strategy. It was a way of life for these soldiers. They lived, fought, and often died in these trenches, surrounded by their comrades and the constant threat of enemy fire. The trenches were not just ditches in the ground, they were complex structures, often with multiple layers and compartments for different purposes. They were homes, hospitals, and fortresses all rolled into one. The weapons of war had evolved, and so too had the strategies. Machine guns, a relatively new invention, were now commonplace. They were devastatingly effective, capable of mowing down rows of soldiers with a single sweep. The war was no longer about brave charges across open fields. It was about survival, about holding your ground and waiting for the right moment to strike. But The machine gun was not the only new weapon to make its mark on the battlefield. Poison gas, another terrifying innovation, was introduced. Invisible and silent, it crept into the trenches, choking and blinding those unfortunate enough to be caught in its path. It added a new level of fear to the already terrifying conditions of trench warfare. And then there were the tanks, hulking beasts of steel that could traverse the rough, muddy terrain of the battlefield. They were virtually impervious to machine gun fire and could crush barbed wire defenses like they were nothing. The sight of these machines rolling towards you must have been truly terrifying. World War I was a war of firsts. The first truly global conflict, the first use of aircraft in warfare, and the first time that the horrors of trench warfare were experienced on such a scale. The face of warfare had changed forever, etching a picture of hell on the minds of those who survived. Across the Atlantic, a nation watched and waited. The United States, a burgeoning world power, had remained neutral in the conflict engulfing Europe. But a series of events would soon alter this stance, thrusting the country into the fray of the Great War. The first of these events was the sinking of the Lusitania. In May of 1915, a German submarine torpedoed this British passenger ship, claiming the lives of more than 1,000 people, including 128 Americans. This brutal attack on civilians stirred outrage in the United States, fueling anti-German sentiment and calls for America to enter the war. Yet, it wasn't until 2 years later that the final straw would come. In January of 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret telegram from Germany to Mexico. Known as the Zimmermann Telegram, it proposed an alliance between the two countries should the United States enter the war. The telegram suggested that Mexico, in exchange for its support, would regain lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Once the contents of the telegram were made public, the American public's mood shifted decisively. The sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann Telegram, combined with Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, proved too much for the United States to ignore. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, joining the Allied powers. The entry of the United States into the war had a significant impact. With its substantial resources and fresh troops, America provided a much-needed boost to the weary Allies. More than 2 million American soldiers, known as doughboys, would serve on the battlefields of Europe before the war's end. The United States' decision to enter the war marked a pivotal moment in the conflict. It signaled a shift from a policy of isolationism to one of international involvement, a shift that would shape the nation's role in the world for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. With the entry of the United States, the scales of war began to tip. The year 1918 marked the end of a nightmare. The guns fell silent on November 11th as the armistice was signed, signaling the cessation of hostilities. The world exhaled a collective sigh of relief, but the aftermath of World War I was a landscape forever changed. The war had been a cataclysmic event, a vortex of destruction that had swallowed up entire generations. The scale of loss was unimaginable, with an estimated 10 million soldiers perishing on the battlefield and countless more civilians losing their lives. It was a war that showed no mercy, cutting short the lives of the young and the old, the innocent and the guilty. In the wake of the war, the world was hit by another invisible enemy, the Spanish flu pandemic. The virus spread like wildfire, taking advantage of weakened immune systems and overcrowded conditions. It claimed an estimated 50 million lives worldwide, exceeding even the death toll of the war itself. However, the end of the war also brought about political changes on a scale never seen before. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust, their power structures and hierarchies swept away by the tide of change. The Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires all fell, creating a power vacuum that led to the rise of new nations. These new nations, born out of the ashes of the old, were eager to assert their independence and sovereignty. They brought with them new ideas and ideologies, reshaping the world's political map. The world had been irrevocably changed, and there was no going back. World War I was a turning point in human history, a grim reminder of the cost of conflict and the lasting changes it can bring about. It was a war that redefined our understanding of war itself, showing us the horrors that humanity can inflict upon itself and the resilience it can show in the face of adversity.